basically, if we go in here, where we've got a live demo. So this is a deployment I ran with the new features in place. And if we look into the logs here, I'm just going to scroll down. We can see this bit here from line 73. That's where the refresh portion of the deployment starts, and all of that output below is new. So what's new is what I call refresh tracing, where basically using the XMLA endpoint, the tool will now set a server trace, which allows us to get live and very detailed information about what's actually going on as part of the refresh. And this is emitted into the log. So you actually have it for reference, and you've got a record of that as part of your deployment pipeline. It allows, particularly for complex data sets, to actually trace in nice granularity which partitions or tables are particularly expensive in terms of refresh, where's a lot of time spent, let's say, with internal Vertipack processing, or where's a lot of time spent with regard to running SQL queries on the remote data end. So that's new, and it has two parts to it. One is the logging, basically just giving visibility. So here, for instance, we can see, if I just zoom in once more, this is Contoso. So we've got a sales table with 100,000 rows, as you can see. And when it comes to importing data as part of a refresh, the default log cadence is every 10,000 rows. So we can see that very nicely. There's an entry for 20,000, 30, 80, 90, 100. And then ultimately here, this is where the refresh completed. And we can see there's a different type of event. So previously we had current events. Now we've got an end event. And that one literally says finish reading data for the sales table and how many rows we've got here. And so that's the type of data we're getting here. And because those end events basically give us a very nice summary of what actually happened for every single partition, how many rows were read, but also how long the refresh took. The second part of what pbi-tools does now is to actually create a summary table. Unfortunately, it's not very nicely formatted in GitHub here, but we'll see a nicer version of that in a second. And that is one which basically gives you a very nice report. Particularly, it's also one that you could actually run some analysis on to get some trends. If you've got a production data set that is in place, for months or years, you could actually export that data to see what are your refresh stats and are there certain patterns here? What's the trend? Are certain partitions growing exponentially or so, right? So all of that is possible. And in addition to just having this output here, that refresh summary is also exported to a CSV file. And we can see that here very nicely. If I then go back into my pipeline run, and again, I'm always using GitHub as an example, but what I'm showing basically works in any of the CI/CD tools in the exact same way. So I've actually enabled CI/CD artifacts here. So if I click on this, I'm actually getting a zip file which contains that CSV file, allowing me to then look into the stats. I've already opened that file. I've got Excel here, and that's basically what it looks like. Let me just how can I collapse that? Here we go. I've got row counts, I've got duration and CPU time metrics for specific partitions in my model. I can also see that there are different types of events actually distinguished here. So if you take this export and pivot it like so, you actually end up getting a very nice and very useful view. So what have I done? So I basically pivoted by table partition here, and then I put the event types here, and the various figures here are all milliseconds. So we can see that the customer table, for instance, spent just over half a second to run the external data query. It took 0.7 seconds to process things inside VertiPack. And the overall duration of the refresh for this entire table was 1.4 seconds. We can see that here. We can also see very easily that the sales table, well, not surprisingly, obviously, is the biggest one. You know, that has 100,000 records, and that was still relatively fast with respect to the execute SQL event, as we can see here. But reading data and processing took substantially longer here. So the total for that is 3.5 seconds. So that's something we can grab from that information very nicely. And then over here, I pivoted the same data, but this time on row count, just so we can see how many rows were actually read for individual tables. So that's the output. That's what's being produced, and I am excited for two reasons. First of all, there's incredibly valuable information in here, and at work, I've actually used this approach already to check out various of our production data sets, and have found lots of interesting insights and unexpected intel, basically, you know, where particular tables that I never really considered to be particularly heavyweight, for instance, actually took up a significant proportion of an overall refresh. The second part is that whilst all of that information is freely available, as long as you've got an XMLA endpoint, currently it's very hard to actually get there. People usually fall back to SQL Profiler, which is a SQL Server management tool, which gives you access to all of that information. But from my point of view, it's really sort of heavyweight and hard. You know, you need the right permissions, first of all. You need to go into SQL Profile and define which events you want to listen to. You need to then start and stop a session. So you're basically collecting information for further analysis. All of that is what pbi-tools now gives you for free, and it just does it automatically, as we've seen. So let's talk about how that all works and how to enable it. I've got the Contoso deployment repo open here. That's publicly available on GitHub under pbi-tools. And I've used that same project to actually demo dataset deployment features previously. And I've basically extended the deployment manifest to add those additional features. So when it comes to refresh tracing, that sits under options refresh. If we go in here, we can see there's a new tracing section. So that's entirely new in this release. That didn't exist prior to that. And that's basically where we're defining everything that happens around tracing. So first of all, we can enable or disable tracing. Secondly, log events basically determines what happens with respect to CI/CD log outputs, and summary determines what happens with regard to the summary metrics we just looked at. So for log events, it's pretty straightforward. We basically put a filter here where we're saying what's the event category we want to capture. So I've got a wildcard here, so any category. What's the SSAS calls that the subclass. So it's basically an event type. And then what's the object type? So what I'm saying here is I only want to see tabular refresh and read data events for partitions. And I want to ignore everything else. If you don't put any filters in here, you're going to be overrun and you're going to get extremely granular events. So it's definitely useful thinking about what you want to see. For summary, there's a slightly different filter pattern. We're basically saying which object types do we want to generate summaries for. So I've only done it at a partition level here, which I think is probably the most useful for production purposes. And then what type of events do I want to capture? And those are the four we already saw in my pivot table earlier. It's basically execute SQL happens first. This is what happens sort of externally with respect to your data source. Then read data kicks in, which is basically loading data into the engine. Then process happens, and tabular refresh is some sort of umbrella event, which basically captures the entire duration of all the various sub-events. So with those settings and with the out path provided as a CSV file path, we then get exactly what we just looked at. Console is a true false property. So if I enable this, I'm going to get the output for that printed to the console. So I'm just going to run that locally, so we can also get the live effect and get an idea of what that looks like in real time. And because it's a relatively small data set, the whole process isn't going to take very long. So there we go. So this is refresh started, events come through in real time as it happens. And now we can also see the summary table nicely formatted. Even this particular version of it is actually very neat as a report. And again, we can see how the settings from here are reflected down here, right? So because I filtered on partition, I only get partition entries here. If I put table there or measure or anything else, those would also be omitted. I filtered on those four subclasses, which then makes those appear here. And over here, in terms of the three metrics, row count, duration, CPU time, that's basically hard-coded. That's what you're always going to get. And we can also see time intelligence, as an example, is actually a calculation group. So that one doesn't read any external data, which is why we do not have an execute SQL event here, right? Because that is basically nothing coming from outside. The same happens for any calculated tables. They would only have read data, process, and tabular refresh, but not execute SQL. I think there is one here. Yeah, metric, actually. That one is actually, I think that one is also a calculation group. But yeah, the same thing would apply for calculated tables. And yeah, that's, let me see. I think that's all there is in terms of introducing that. I mentioned the blog post earlier. So just going back to that, I've done a pretty extensive write-up here of this particular feature. So it's all happening under refresh tracing. So I'm talking a little bit about the motivation and sort of what problem we're addressing here. Then I'm giving a complete pbi-tools deployment manifest in order to then explain the various tracing related settings. I'm talking about what types of event categories are exported and where to find further reference for those. And also how the log event filter works and how you can actually use wildcards in a very flexible way. And then we've got an example for the output. We've got an example for the CSV file. And we have an example for that pivot table we were just looking at. And at the end, I collected a few references, blog posts and book articles, which are available also related to tracing and actually collecting those exact stats.